Greetings, folks. I think today we'll talk a little bit about a few things, specifically vocabulary, spelling, and typography, and maybe a little bit about grammatical regularization. I'd like to address what's called the inkhorn controversy first, and then take a look at some attempts to regularize spelling in English, and then towards the end, look at some changes in the way we actually visually represent the sounds that we make. This will involve a brief excursion into etymology, which I think you'll probably enjoy. The first thing we should talk about is the inkhorn words controversy. The term is first attested in 1543, and in many ways is an ongoing controversy in the language to this day. What it revolves around is the use of imported and foreign-seeming or foreign-sounding words into the language, specifically in the written language, in order to, on the one hand, elevate the diction, and on the other, to perhaps express things that the language couldn't otherwise express. As we've talked about before, it's during the 16th century that English starts becoming again a language of intellectual or high culture discourse. It entered the century with a genuine deficiency in this regard. While Old English, as we've discussed, was perfectly capable of handling any area of discourse that language could actually handle, by the end of the Middle Ages it still hadn't completely recovered from the lopping off of its high culture vocabulary. It was up to being a literary language again, largely thanks to Chaucer, but not exclusively, of course. But in the language of philosophic or scientific or religious discourse, it was still lacking, especially at a time when human knowledge was beginning to expand very rapidly, and all of the languages involved in that expansion had to be ready to expand their own vocabularies to accommodate that new learning. As you might expect, most of the words coming into the language in the inkhorn controversy were, as the name attests, written words. This is not spoken language. And as the prestige language continued to be Latin and increasingly Greek, the vocabulary coming into the language in this context is also from those sources. As such, it was often seen as being pretentious, as writers trying less to elevate their ideas, but rather elevate themselves through some sort of a disguise or facade. And there was also a genuine fear and anxiety that the language was being corrupted by foreign influences, that it was becoming something other than English. This, of course, involves the assumption that any language can have a pure state, which is a dubious assumption at best, and completely nonsensical where English is concerned, I think. That said, the critics of this sudden influence of learned vocabulary did arguably have a point. So to broaden things out, the inkhorn words controversy largely revolves around a broader discussion of how one ought to write. What is the proper vocabulary for a person expressing themselves in writing? There were, just as there are now, a number of different opinions on the subject. If you'd like an example from the time, here's Thomas Wilson in his writing manual, The Art of Rhetoric. Among all other lessons, this should first be learned, that we never affect any strange inkhorn terms, but to speak as is commonly received, neither seeking to be over fine, or yet living over careless, using our speech as most men do, and ordering our wits as the fewest have done. Some seek so far for outlandish English that they forget altogether their mother's language, and I dare swear this, if some of their mothers were alive, they were not able to tell what they say, and yet these fine English clerks will say they speak their mother tongue if a man should charge them for counterfeiting the king's English. Or if you like, we can skip ahead to 1672 and take a look at what John Dryden has to say. We meet daily with those fops who value themselves on their traveling and pretend they cannot express their meaning in English because they would put off to us some French phrase of the last edition. Okay, so taken together, what do these two passages suggest? What do they show us? Well, let's see. On the one hand, Wilson is concerned with what he calls strange inkhorn terms. Strange here basically meaning foreign. He's obviously concerned about the continuity of the language. He speaks of the ancestral inheritance of the language, the mother's language, the king's English. So he's aware that the language is in a state of rapid change, which of course in the 16th century it was, and largely at the level of vocabulary. So his analysis is correct. And yet he's also aware of a couple of different functions of language, isn't he? This is fascinating, and this is something that I've been really interested in, since I was an undergrad, I suppose. Language can do a few different things. On the one hand, it can communicate. That's its primary purpose. And Wilson is, of course, addressing this. As he says, he wants people to use words in an accessible manner, that is, speak as is commonly received. He's presenting the language as a common inheritance of the culture that speaks it. This is accurate. This is true. And yet he's also saying that writers should order their wits as the fewest have done. That is, he's suggesting that writers should use common words, or rather ordinary words, to do extraordinary things, and that this is the best writing. That is, for Wilson, the best writing is the expression of rare or great ideas in language that anyone can understand. I totally endorse this position. This, in fact, is my position on effective writing and always has been. At the same time, it's possible that he, and maybe even at times I, take that position to extremes. Because, of course, when he's writing, there is a genuine deficiency in the vocabulary of English, in the lexicon of English. And some imports are necessary, and even where not strictly necessary, arguably beneficial in enriching the language's capacity and enriching the language's potential for intellectual expression, which is what he's concerned with here. So it's arguable that Wilson's being too much of a purist, and yet at the same time his concern with maintaining the purity of the language may not be just some jingoistic pose, but rather a legitimate ethical position in attempting to keep the ideas that the language expresses open and accessible to anyone who is capable of reading the language. That is, his approach to language is inclusive. And what he is implicitly accusing these fine English clerks, to take his term, of doing is creating an exclusionary dialect that most speakers of the language can't understand. This is not merely a matter of style. This is a matter of ethics. Because to the extent that our language becomes exclusionary, the diction itself, rather than the ideas, comes to occupy a sort of a gatekeeper function. If you don't speak the jargon, you can't be part of the conversation. This is a concern I have, quite frankly, with much of the academic discourse of our own time. There are very few ideas, at least in the humanities, that can't be expressed in relatively straightforward English. And yet, anyone who's spent time immersing themselves in the scholarly journals of various humanities, and here English is about the worst, will attest to the unnecessary complexity of that discourse, the exclusionary nature, the gatekeeping function of that critical jargon that is so popular and so socially isolating in the contemporary academic humanities. I'm going to put a pin in that one and probably come back to it a little later in the term, because as I said, I think this is an ethical consideration. When we turn to Dryden, we see similar concerns, expressed perhaps a little more concisely. That is, he addresses the pretentiousness of importing what he calls some French phrase from the last edition in the expressions of those fashionable gentlemen who pride themselves on their traveling. But for Dryden also, there's another consideration here. That term fops is one that I've always found interesting. I don't know that it has an exact equivalent in contemporary English. The nearest I can get to it is probably metrosexual. That is, a fop, understood in Dryden's terms, is a fashionable gentleman who's up on all of the trends and whose masculinity is in question. The antithesis of a lumberjack, I guess. So what Dryden is doing is he's introducing into the conversation, and I don't think he's the first one to do it, an element of gender that importing foreign terms, particularly French terms, undermines one's masculinity. That straightforward, robust English is masculine, and fancy, fashionable French terms are effeminate in some way. Now, we'll find as we move forward into the modern period that questions of gender are actually very important where questions of dialect and vocabulary and accent are concerned. And these questions are also tied up, I think, with questions of nativism. So keep your eyes on that as we move forward, especially after we hit the Industrial Revolution. That's a fun conversation that some of you may actually want to tackle in your final papers. Another concern that comes up with Dryden's use of the word fop is substance. There's a suggestion here, and I am in some sympathy with it, that an undue concern with fashion indicates a lack of underlying substance. If you call a person foppish, you are saying that this person is somehow insubstantial, that they're all surface, they're all sheen, no content. And of course, fashion itself is, by definition, ephemeral and insubstantial. It's a passing thing. And Dryden is addressing himself, or trying to address himself, to the more substantial, the more lasting elements of the language. So there are many layers to this little passage from Dryden that he brings into the discourse on the use of language in writing. But so far this conversation has just been a little too abstract, hasn't it? So how about we take a look at some concrete examples? Here are some words, and I've posted a handout that contains these and a few more, that were rejected by the end of the early modern period as being too artificial, as being inkhorn words. Now, when I'm doing this as a live class, I would typically read some of these words off to students and see if they could guess as to what their meanings actually are. We don't have that option right now because I'm just talking to you and you're listening later on, but I think it's still worth looking at the words themselves. That first one I've always been fond of, anacephalize, to recapitulate. Take a look at that. This is a clue as to where we're going here. Anacephalize sounds really awkward and foreign, simply because we don't know what it is. Nobody uses that word anymore. But how about recapitulate? Give that one some thought too. Or to take a look at another one, let's see. Adminiculation, simply for aid. This is the kind of inflated vocabulary that both Wilson and Dryden were railing against, and that I frequently object to as well. Why use a 6-syllable word for a 1-syllable idea? That is pretentious. That is, as I said, an inflation, an unnecessary inflation. So stylistically, certainly, adminiculation is pointless, unless you're trying to artificially boost yourself, inflate yourself. But this isn't the case with every single so-called inkhorn term, though, is it? For example, take a look at demit, simply meaning to send away. Well, we didn't keep that one, but we did keep submit, which has the same etymology. It simply means to send down. So what is it about demit that is unacceptable, whereas submit is acceptable? And what I'm getting at here will become apparent in the next slide. Let's take a look at another one. Expede, to accomplish. We didn't keep that one, but we did keep impede, and we kept expedient. Or for exsicate, to dry. That may sound a little pretentious to some, but how about dehydrate? Or we do have a word, desiccate, desiccated. So I might call into question Dryden's critique of the use of such words as these being merely verbal fashion accessories. Or if you like, there's one that I actually regret that we no longer use here. Take a look at the very last one on the list, temulant, for drunk. Now we do use intoxicated, which also would have been seen as an inkhorn word. But temulant, doesn't that sound like a good way of describing really, really drunk? I think we should bring that one back. Because of course, not all inkhorn terms were rejected. Many simply became part of everyday English. Coming out of Latin, we have such words as ability, agile, appropriate, autograph. Don't worry, I won't read the entire list. But these are all very common, aren't they? Harass, maturity, scientific. Or coming from Greek indirectly through Latin, we have such words as atmosphere, autograph, and chaos, dogma, pathetic, system, tactics. Or directly from Greek, catastrophe, democracy, ostracize, phenomenon, thermometer. These are everyday words. And while I do find myself in much sympathy with folks like Dryden and Wilson, and to a large degree consider myself among them, there's a limit to the argument, isn't there? Because ultimately, the final authority on language will simply be usage. If people find a word useful, it's a good word. If people don't find a word useful, it will disappear. It will simply not be used. Now, why we would keep a word like submit and reject a word like demit could be entirely random. Honestly, it could. There may not be an underlying logic there. But either way, and this is another theme I'd like you to hold on to, usage is the final arbiter where language is concerned. Not the writers of manuals, and not grammatical curmudgeons such as myself, but the speech community itself is always going to be the final authority where language is concerned. These words were all criticized as being foreign importations, as undermining the purity of the language, and yet they're simply part of the everyday language as we have it today. The theme I'm getting at here is that there is no fixed standard for any language. In fact, the definition of a living language is a language that is still undergoing change, and the definition of a dead language is a language that has ceased to undergo change. I think this is worth bearing in mind. So, as we move on from this to our next topic, I'd like to leave you with a few questions. 1. Why would there be a market for manuals on English usage? These have been quite common since the early modern period, and yet they didn't exist prior to the 16th century. So give some thought as to why that might be. What are the social conditions that exist in the modern English period that didn't exist in the pre-modern English period or periods, that would give rise to a market, a demand, for people telling other people how to speak and write? You might also ask yourself, in this inkhorn controversy, how many functions does language serve, and which of those functions seem to be in competition where this controversy is concerned? I've touched upon a couple, but of course there could be more. And, again, something I've already touched upon, why the gendered slight in Dryden's passage? This is a question that, as I said, we'll be exploring more as we go on in the modern English period, so I'd like you to have it in the front of your mind from here on in. What is the relation between language on the one hand and gender construction on the other? What conceivable relationship could they have? What relationships actually do they have? I may end up asking you to write on one of these questions for your next reflection, which I'll be assigning on Friday. So, as I said, do please give these some thought, and I do look forward to seeing what you think, whether in writing or in conversation on Friday. And this brings us around to the topic of spelling regularization, or in some cases even spelling reform. It was during the 16th century and into the 17th that English speakers, or more accurately English writers, became increasingly concerned with how to spell words in English. In Middle English, of course, this had never been an issue, or at least not a major issue, because words were simply spelled the way they sounded. So, of course, spelling varied between London English, say, and Northwest Midlands English, so between Chaucer's dialect and the dialect of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But within those dialect groups, or within those dialect regions, spelling was fairly consistent. The spread of printed spelling, on the other hand, changed all of that because the printing press, more than any other influence, divorced spelling from phonetics. So from the end of the 15th century on, we were no longer spelling words the way they sounded. And we've discussed this in past talks, so there's no need to go into that right now. Another effect of the printing press, which again we've gone into before, was centralization. Most of the presses were located in London, some in some of the other larger towns, but mostly in London. So again, as we move away from manuscript to printed book culture, we have words written, say, in a northern dialect being printed by someone who speaks a southern dialect. Well, the opportunities for confusion here are multiple, aren't they? So as printed books became more and more a part of the culture, and the printing industry became more and more centralized around the big towns, and around London in particular, there was a desire for regularization. Well, why exactly might this have come about? One is we are at this point in the middle of a time when the pronunciation of English is under rapid change. The great vowel shift, of course, is underway. This means that pronunciation is changing fast enough that people are aware that words that they speak as adults do not sound the same way as those same words sounded when they were children. Now, of course, while language is always changing, having the pronunciation of one's mother tongue change significantly over the course of one's own lifetime could arguably be a little bit unsettling. So what this brought in was a desire for stability in language. Now, this desire for stability is not merely linguistic, I don't think. I think it's tied up to other social developments. What concluded the Middle Ages in England, of course, were the 30-year conflicts known as the Wars of the Roses. And what followed from that politically also was a desire for stability. So the desire for stability in language mirrors, in some sense, the desire for stability in society itself. This is a time, of course, as well, when there is conflict between Protestant and Catholic in the fields of religion and politics both. And by mid-century, we've seen England turn away from the Roman Church and then try to be forced back to the Roman Church in the mid-1550s, and then brought back again towards political and theological Protestantism with Elizabeth after 1558. So the world itself is quite unstable at this time. So the desire for linguistic stability is really, really understandable. Add to this that English is being used in an increasing number of fields. And this as well has to do with the rise of the printing press. English is being used in political discourse, not just in elite levels, but in a wide popular context. That is, really the whole literate public of England is debating politics at this time in print, or at least around printed sources, written from multiple perspectives. So as English moves increasingly into a variety of fields, this expanding of its sphere of engagement is going to, I think, fairly naturally lead to a desire to have a common standard that is universally comprehensible. Another factor would be comparison with Latin and Greek, which, of course, for anybody attending university, would be mandatory subjects of study. Of course, these languages have a prestige that English lacks. So there is, and I think to a large degree remains, but certainly in the early modern period is, an inferiority complex where English is concerned relative to the classical languages. That is, there's a desire to bring English up to, say, the standard of Latin. This is reflected as well in the style of prose that develops during the 16th century. A number of different spelling systems were proposed, particularly during the latter 16th and early 17th centuries. And each of these had a different emphasis. Some emphasized accuracy, so trying to bind one letter to one sound, so that when you looked at the word, you knew exactly how to pronounce it. Others were more focused on custom and usefulness. That is, there was allowance made for what people were already used to, and also for how adaptable the system might be to the language down the road. I've posted an example of one of these to the Moodle page, John Hart's system. And I think if you take a look over that, you'll see a nice concrete example of what I'm talking about. Hart's system focuses on accuracy. It was never adopted, but it is actually quite interesting and was influential, by the way, in the development of the International Phonetic Alphabet. One interesting development of the move towards spelling reform or spelling standardization is the introduction of etymological spelling. That is, once spelling is no longer a reliable indication of pronunciation, it starts to actually fill other functions. A couple of examples here are worth looking at. Our word doubt, D-O-U-B-T, comes directly from the Latin dubitare, which itself comes from debitum. Now, in Middle English, the word doubt existed, but there was no B in it. It tended to be spelled D-O-U-T. Why? Because that's how you say it. In English, the B in doubt has never been pronounced. It was inserted into the word purely for etymological reasons, to indicate where it came from. Another example is our word damn, D-A-M-N, which for its entire tenure in the English language has never been pronounced damn. It comes from damnare, to inflict loss on, which in itself comes from damnum, loss or damage. So the damned are literally the lost. That's what that word means. But the N was added during the 16th century, again to reflect its etymological origin, never having been pronounced. This is a very bookish thing to do, isn't it? And it's only possible because of the printing press. This kind of etymological spelling is not possible in a manuscript culture, where there is no universal standard of spelling. That is, it's only with the advent of the printing press that the spelling of words comes to indicate anything at all other than pronunciation. And this additional function, this etymological function, carries with it a fair bit of what we might call social or cultural inertia. And it lies largely behind, I think, our maintaining of Middle English spellings effectively for modern English words. In modern advertising, it's very common to spell night, N-I-T-E, rather than N-I-G-H-T. And this makes perfect sense, doesn't it? That's how we pronounce it. We use the E after a single consonant to indicate that the vowel coming before that consonant is long, so this is just simply what our spelling does. We pronounce it, therefore, N-I-T-E. But for etymological reasons, as much as anything else, we maintain the antiquated spelling, the really outdated spelling of N-I-G-H-T. Same thing with the other night, K-N-I-G-H-T. Or any number of other words with silent letters that once upon a time had been pronounced. I'm dubious of these arguments, by the way. On the one hand, yes, they do give us the word's etymology, and it's very interesting. I find that fascinating, actually, because I love words. But I sometimes wonder whether the etymological argument is an argument, a genuine argument, in the sense that it is genuinely believed as the primary reason for the position being put forward, or if it functions more like an apologetic. And by apologetic, what I mean is an argument constructed after the fact, meant to support a predetermined conclusion, which is effectively the function of the entire field of religious apologetics, and why I can't take people like C.S. Lewis seriously. But here I'm verging wide of the topic of our course, so we'll move on. If we want to look at specific changes in orthography, then we have some changes in how certain letters were used. There's the adoption of the Y in the space of the Old and Middle English thorn, which is where we get what many modern readers read as ye old, which simply would have been pronounced the old in the 16th century. So that is, thorn becomes a Y. In the early modern period, V and U were interchangeable. The reason here is that they're really just variants of the same letter and didn't come to be seen as different letters, really, until the modern period. If you take a look at Old Latin inscriptions, for example, they will have V's, but they will have no U's. So the use of the V exclusively as a consonant and the U exclusively as a vowel is actually a modern innovation. Another innovation is the use of the letter J. There is no J in the Roman alphabet. There's no J in the Latin alphabet. So where in English we might write Jehovah with a J, in Latin that J is an I. It's Jehovah. The J was designed simply by putting a little hook on the bottom of the I to indicate that it was serving the function of a consonant. And of course, in different languages, it stands for different sounds. J in English, but Y in, for example, the Nordic languages, for example, the word fjord, and either a h or a h in various dialects of Spanish. In early modern English as well, I and Y were often interchangeable. Now, in Old English, when the Y indicated a vowel, it indicated a sound distinct from the sound indicated by I. But very often in the early modern period, these were seen as interchangeable, as representing the same sound. The other change that I want to take some time with is the use of the long and short S. The long S is often rendered simply as an F without the cross piece. And the short S, of course, is the S we now use as our standard S. The short S is somewhat of an innovation as well. In old manuscripts, long S's are more common, and sometimes they would have a hook on the bottom as well. But by the modern English period, they'd come to be used often to indicate the same sound in different positions. So, for example, in an initial or medial position, that is coming at the beginning or in the middle of a word, the long S would be used, but the short S was common in the terminal position, as the last letter of the word. Eventually, of course, the long S was just dropped, because there's no necessary distinction between either of those. They indicate the same sound or sounds. So the short S that we now take for granted as being an S is, as with the letter J, an innovation, a fairly recent innovation. Now, before I take this typography question a little further, I do just want to draw your attention to a concrete example of John Hart's orthography system published in 1569. I've given you a handout that lays out his alphabet and that also includes this passage that you can see on the slide. I'm not going to read it here for you. What I'm going to do instead is make a suggestion, and that is you take a look at the handout, get a sense of how it's supposed to sound. Each of his letters is given a corresponding value in the IPA, so you'll be able to see exactly how it's supposed to sound. And maybe try reading it on your own, either just to yourself to see how well it works, and it actually does work pretty well. And if you want, you could even practice it a few times and record it and post it to the Moodle page for other people to listen to. I would be genuinely curious and really interested to see how you do reading from Hart's system, which does have a one-to-one correspondence between letter and sound. Now, there are arguments for and arguments against this kind of spelling regularization, and I think I might actually like to discuss those with you on Friday. So as I said, I'm not going to say too much about it here, but if you feel like taking on that challenge, I really would be interested to see what you come up with. What I will read out loud, though, is this opening stanza to John Donne's wonderful poem, The Flea, published posthumously in 1633. And the reason I'm doing so is that I usually hand this out in class and ask a student to read it aloud. This is a facsimile of the 1633 edition, and therefore has the orthography of the 1633 edition. And it's interesting to see how orthography, even unconsciously, draws or pulls us toward particular pronunciations. So follow this along with your eyes and see how you're inclined to pronounce things as we go. Mark but this flea, and mark in this, how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee. Thou know'st that this cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead, yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two, and this, alas, is more than we would do. All right, now, take a look at the use of those long S's, especially in the third line. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee. How do you really want to say that when you're looking at those words? 'Cause, well, here's the thing. Donne was brilliant. He was a very clever man. He was aware of how words worked both auditorially and visually. And by his lifetime, the word fuck is certainly attested and had been for about 100 years or so. So my hypothesis with this little gem of a stanza is that Donne knows exactly what he's doing. He's playing a visual gag. And it's a fun one, isn't it? I know how fun it is because every year when I ask students to read this out loud, somebody trips up and says what Donne actually seems to want them to say. But in any case, Where does the word fuck come from? It would be almost professionally irresponsible of me as a teacher of the history of the English language not to say something about what may well be our most versatile word. But where does this wonderful word come from? It's been attested in English since about the 15th century, so for the entire modern English period, and seems to go back a good deal further than that, but its exact origins are not exactly clear. A few possibilities given by the Random House Historical Dictionary of American Slang include the following. 1. It might come from Middle Dutch fokken, meaning to thrust or to copulate with. Or it could come from Norwegian fucka, meaning to copulate. Or a very closely related word from Swedish focka, meaning to strike, to push, to copulate. Or possibly fuck, meaning penis. Another possibility is the old High German flog, meaning to plow, as in to plow a field. If the word were attested in Old English, which it's not, it would probably be fukan, F-U-C-A-N, just working back from how it looks now. But again, this is not attested, so we can't actually say that the Old English actually had something like it. But given that many other Germanic languages did, for example, as I said, fokken, fuka, foka, it would be, I think, even unlikely if there were not a fukan in Old English. Because, of course, not every word in the language would have gotten written down. We don't actually have that much written down. We only have, in terms of Old English poetry anyways, some 30,000 lines. That's not much. That's just Beowulf times 10. So we know that a lot of that language has been lost. In any case, these are some possibilities of where this word may have come from. There is, of course, a common folk etymology, that it was an abbreviation of a criminal charge for unlawful carnal knowledge. You hear that one going around, but that is patently untrue. As I said, that's a folk etymology. Folk etymologies are things that are constructed after the fact that might make sense to people who don't understand the actual history of the words. But it looks like, again, taking a look at the closest cognate, the Middle Dutch fokken, that it didn't originally have a pejorative or rude connotation, but we've already discussed this in the Middle English period with the reduction in status of the Old English word shitan, which of course simply means to poop, but from the Norman conquest onward is considered to be rude. I strongly suspect that the hypothesized fukan, which I didn't make up, follows a similar trajectory. Or even if it comes in from Dutch, fokken, which I think is the most likely of the alternatives given in the Random House Dictionary, that a similar dynamic would be in play. It would be a lower status word at the time that it came into the language simply by virtue of being Germanic rather than French. But though the word clearly begins with an association with copulation, that is, as a verb, having to do with sex, it hasn't stayed that way. It's become extremely flexible, hasn't it? So, as a verb, if we want to run through the various parts of speech, to fuck means, of course, to have sex with, to copulate with. But it doesn't just mean that, does it? If you're fucked by the system hasn't actually copulated with you. So, to fuck means something other than to have sex with. Similarly, if you fuck up, you're doing something else again. You're making a mistake. But if you fuck around, you could be doing a couple of different things, couldn't you? You could be cheating on your significant other, or you could be not taking something seriously. And these are not all of the possibilities, even if we just look at fuck as a verb. It can also, of course, be a noun. A fuck can be that which one does not give. And in fact, you can not only not give a fuck, you can not give a flying fuck. Who knew fucks had wings? Or a fuck can be a person as a noun, as in he's just a stupid fuck. Does this mean that he is a stupid copulation? No, it means he is a dolt, or an idiot, or an all-around waste of your time. And again, without exhausting the possibilities of nouns, we can move on to fuck as an intensifier, both as an adjective and an adverb. As an adjective, I can say, wow, that moose is fucking huge. On the other hand, I can say, the American response to coronavirus is completely fucked. That is, I can use it as a past participle, which is a verbal adjective. In this case, indicating badly mistaken. On the other hand, if we are paddling down a river and all of a sudden find ourselves heading rapidly for a waterfall, we might also say we are completely fucked, and in this case, not so much in the sense of being mistaken as being in serious trouble. So it's flexible. Similarly, when it's used as an adverb, you might say, wow, Roger, this part of the lecture is really fucking rude. I might say, that's fucking terrible, or that's fucking great. It's kind of like very, but if very were on steroids. And of course, fuck can also be an exclamation, and an exclamation both positive and negative. I might say, for example, oh fuck, or oh fuck, or oh fuck, or oh fuck. And all of these mean different things. On the other hand, I might ask, what the fuck? Indicating surprise, confusion. Or I might, if a student is being very rude or interruptive or downright disrespectful of their fellow students, I might say to said student, get the fuck out of my classroom. And I have done that, by the way. So you can see, even in just this handful of examples that I've given you, how flexible this word is. And this brings around the question of swearing. Why do people swear? My grandmother used to say, now Grandma was literally Victorian. She was born in Scotland in 1892. That if you have to swear to express yourself, you simply don't know how to use the language. But given the ubiquity of swearing, I would say swearing actually serves a necessary function. It's a way of expressing one's internal emotional state in ways that we might say are strictly speaking illegitimate, given the rules of the language, but that push at the constraints of that legitimacy itself, push at the limits that linguistic rules put on people in terms of what kinds of expression they're actually permitted to engage in. In fact, I've read studies that indicate, and we can hold this up against the inkhorn word controversy, that while people who speak in unnecessarily long words and unnecessarily obscure words tend to be seen by others as untrustworthy or hiding something, people who drop the occasional F-bomb tend to be seen actually as more trustworthy, more approachable. Which I guess might be one of the reasons why I swear so fucking much when I'm teaching. In fact, I very rarely swear at home. It's something I mostly do at work. But onward. As I said before, this is a discussion right now largely of etymology, and it made me very happy yesterday when I was trying to expand this little talk from what I usually do, to find the origin of one of the most colorful uses of the word fuck. And that is flying fuck. For how long have fucks known how to fly? Well, here's the answer. Round about 1800, or perhaps 1799, I've encountered both dates, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Rowlandson published a poem with a lovely graphic to go with it, titled New Feats in Horsemanship, and it reads as follows. Well mounted on a mettled steed, famed for his strength as well as speed, Corina and her favourite buck are pleased to have a flying fuck, while o'er the downs the courser strains with fiery eyes and loosened reins. Around his neck her arms she flings, behind her buttocks move like springs, while Jack keeps time with every motion and pours in love's delicious potion. Now don't tell me you don't feel just a little bit enriched for knowing that. But all of that being said, I should probably also address the topic of grammatical regularization. And the move towards grammatical regularization was a little later in coming than the desires for the regularization of either typography or spelling. This was largely a phenomenon of the Restoration and further. That is, this is a product of the Age of the Enlightenment. And here again, we might ask why. Well, the timing actually tells us a fair bit. One, again, that desire for stability or regulation following a period of profound conflict, in this case the English Civil War, makes sense. The use of language is almost always connected to politics in some way, actually in multiple ways. So given that following the English Civil War, there was this strong desire for a more stable society, it stands to reason that there would be a drive towards stability or regularization of the language itself. Speaking of reason, of course, the other name for the Enlightenment is the Age of Reason. This is a time when all aspects of human life are being submitted to rational scrutiny and measured against the standard of reason, not necessarily to the exclusion of all else, but to a greater degree than anything else. And if things are found to be irrational, they're necessarily also found to be wanting. This is also, I think, tied up with the scientific revolution, because of course by 1660, the scientific revolution, which I talked to you a bit about the other day, is well underway and is very exciting because of course it's overturning a lot of the older superstitious ways of looking at the world and opening up new ways of understanding both ourselves and the world in which we live. And again, it is unsurprising that language should be submitted to this kind of scrutiny as well. Similarly, as I've already mentioned, in comparison to the classical languages Latin and Greek, English still seemed, to people who made the formal study of language their profession, to be not even fully formed, to be incomplete, because it didn't have a fully articulated grammatical system or grammatical theory. As for who was pushing for this change, or who were pushing for this change, as I mentioned a moment ago, these tended to be people trained in the classical languages, the study of which was actually becoming increasingly complex and increasingly scientific, largely as a result of the discovery of Sanskrit following the exploration and subsequent colonization of India. In fact, it's from that contact with India, that cultural contact with India, that the realization of the existence of the Indo-European language family emerged. But as you might expect, it was often the writers as well who were pushing for this kind of regularization. So folks like Dryden, Defoe, Swift, Pope, I believe as well. And if you've ever read the literature of particularly the 18th century, you will not find this surprising. It's a very rationally constructed literature. If you read Pope, for example, a writer whom I do not find particularly interesting, it's nonetheless undeniable that he's pretty much metrically perfect. Technically, I don't think there's ever been a better writer in the English language, or a more accomplished writer in the English language than Alexander Pope. And it is that regularity, that hyper-rationality of his language, the extreme precision of virtually every one of his lines, that does really make him an artist worthy of respect. But as I said, this drive toward regularization, towards rationalization, is largely a product of the time, is largely a product of the Age of Reason, of the Enlightenment, of that whole way of viewing the world. And English was not alone. It's during the Enlightenment as well that the French developed the Académie Française, which is the academy that exists to this day, that decides by committee what actually is French and what is not French. A similar committee exists in Spain, I believe, and also in some of the other European languages as well. I think Italian has one. There was a drive to establish a similar academy in English, but that drive was never fulfilled, and I think it's fortunate that it wasn't. And I suspect that one of the reasons why it wasn't is the already very broad dialectal variation in English, as well politically as the tendency in England at the time not to submit to monolithic authority. Now remember, very early in the Enlightenment, England underwent the Glorious Revolution, which I talked to you a bit about the other day. They threw off tyrannical monarchical rule for rule by Parliament. That is, for rule where the primary power lies with elected representatives, lies with not necessarily all of the people. That wouldn't be the case for a couple of more centuries, but at least not with a monolithic hereditary dynasty, which still was the case in, for example, both France and Spain. So which countries opted for a central controlling body that would say what is and is not the language, and which opted against it, actually does correspond fairly closely to who remained with the church, that is, a monolithic identity in itself, and who partook in the Protestant Reformation, which in and of itself was a rejection of exactly that monolithic authority that the church represented. As understandable as this urge toward regularization is, and I do understand it, it does come with some problems. One, the models being applied to English during the Enlightenment, which is sort of the height of that drive toward prescriptive grammar, are dead languages, which definitively don't change. In that sense, both Greek and Latin could be seen as functioning as sort of straitjackets on the organic growth of the language. And in any case, setting definite standards does risk fossilizing the language, inhibiting its growth, inhibiting its use, its organic use, in the mouths and pens of people who just use it as part of their everyday life, which is ultimately what language is defined by, regardless of what, well, as I said, curmudgeons like me might have to say about it. To give you an example of some of the problems that arise when applying, say, the standards of Latin to the grammar of English, which was and in some ways continues to be the norm, here are a couple of examples. One, many of you have probably been told that you should not end a clause with a preposition, or that you shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition. For example, I might ask, who are you talking to? That's a completely comprehensible sentence. It does make, by the strictest curmudgeonly standards, two grammatical errors. One, it uses a subject pronoun when it should use an object pronoun, so the who should actually be whom, and more importantly for us at the moment, it puts a preposition at the end. So, strictly speaking, that sentence should be, to whom are you speaking? Or did I say talking? I don't remember. Doesn't matter. Or I might say, if I don't want to put it as a question, I don't know what you're talking about. And once again, about is a preposition, and by that strict rule of not ending clauses with prepositions, which only emerged in English during the Enlightenment, then my grammar is wrong. And I should be saying something like, I do not know about what you are talking. And here's where we come to the problem. Old English, Middle English, and early modern English up to the period when the grammarians were saying you shouldn't end a clause with a preposition, were all perfectly comfortable ending clauses with prepositions. And here's the reason why. Preposition, meaning preposition, coming before, is a Latin term. In Latin, you don't end a clause with a preposition. So this is a grafting, really a Procrustean grafting of a completely foreign standard onto English. And it still has traction in the language to this day. I mean, quite famously, although I'm not sure whether this is true or apocryphal, Winston Churchill once ended a sentence with a preposition and was called on it by a journalist, to which he replied, "That is the type of arrant pedantry up with which I will not put." So this is at least one place where that drive toward setting rules, setting rational rules, actually runs against the history of the language and is very much an imposition. Another one of those impositions is the rule against having a split infinitive. That is, the infinitive form of the verb in English is to plus the base form, so to eat, to run, to go. And the 18th century prescriptivists decided, again on the authority of Latin, that putting, for example, an adverb between the to and the root was ungrammatical. Up till then, it had been perfectly fine. But after then, it was not fine. So according to that rule, the famous line from the Star Trek series, to boldly go where no one has gone before, should actually be to go boldly where no one has gone before, or perhaps boldly to go where no one has gone before, but anything other than the way they actually have it. In Latin, there is a good reason why you can't split an infinitive. It's one fucking word. I gave you a couple of examples a few slides ago. Dubitare, dampnare. One word. The are, on ere, or ore ending in Latin is what indicates the infinitive. So this is a rule that has nothing to do with the English language and yet was tacked onto it by the 18th century prescriptivists. Another one that bugs the crap out of me, to be honest with you, is, God damn it, what was it? I had it in my mind. Is the prescription against the double negative. You were all told, when you were in probably kindergarten or grade 1, that you should never do a double negative because a negative times another negative is a positive. That is, the rules of arithmetic get tacked onto the language. This also is a product of the Enlightenment, prior to which double negatives were just peachy frickin' keen, because prior to the Enlightenment, people recognized that language is not fucking math. So the more negatives you tacked on, the more emphatically negative the statement became. That's how language works. Because language is not math. Math is a language, but language is not math. Their Venn diagrams are nested. So those are 3 examples of what I've always seen to be very intrusive rules imposed upon the language by, quite frankly, grammatical busybodies. But insofar as some of them do have some traction still, I do have to advise you to follow at least a couple of them. Don't worry about the preposition thing. I think that's absolute nonsense. And don't worry about the split infinitive thing. I think that's absolute nonsense. Those are both, I think, finally dying much belated deaths. The rule against double negatives seems to have some traction, so you probably should follow that. But here as well, I need to bring up the difference between prescriptive and descriptive grammar. Prior to the Enlightenment, really, grammar was descriptive. And I think grammar is most useful when it is descriptive. That is, if you take a look at a grammar of English, you'll be taking a look at not a list of rules of how you ought to speak, but simply what the language does. Prescriptive grammar, on the other hand, tells you how you should speak, how you should write. This is a relatively recent development, mostly, as I said, coming out of Latin, and coming out of that regulating impulse that so drove many of the thinkers of the Enlightenment, and that leads to, I think, many untenable appeals to authority. Same thing works with dictionaries, which we'll talk about in a little while. A dictionary, for instance, is not actually a list of how you must use words. It's a list of how words are used at particular points in history. They're always subject to change. Same thing's true of grammar. Grammar is also always subject to change. And when we become too prescriptive about it, too rule-oriented about it, we really do inhibit the organic use of the language, the way that language has been used for the literally tens of thousands of years for which humans have been using language. But there's a place for prescriptive grammar, of course. Mostly, I think, it belongs in the ESL classroom. People learning the language from outside and coming into the language community need to learn the standards by which the language community works. This is the same with any other community. When you're coming in from outside, the obligation is on you to learn the proper standards. And prescriptive grammar is also useful when we distinguish, for example, between prestige and non-prestige dialects, because this distinction is pragmatic. There are certain instances where it's to your advantage to speak one dialect or write one dialect. There are certain instances where it's to your advantage to speak or write another, that kind of thing. But to become too hung up on rules, I think, really inhibits the full range of language use or language usage. In any case, that's probably about what I have to say for today, so I should think about wrapping this little talk up. And that about wraps it up for today. I hope you found this interesting. It's been a little bit scattered. I've been trying to cast a fairly broad net in terms of subject matter today. For our next talk, I want to get into the chapter on the spread of English, so please at least have begun reading that for Wednesday, and I suspect that that will probably form the bulk of our conversation for Friday's tutorial. As always, thank you for listening. Bye for now.